Okay, well, this is, once again, Notes Towards a Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling. And this is, once again, and perhaps, part 4 of part 12, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy. And if you recall where we are in part 12, which and part 12, the sum of part 12, as David reads, elaborates, and/or interprets these two versions of the story of Oedipus, one from Sophocles called Oedipus Rex, and the other, as I've mentioned, often neglected, tragedy of Aristophanes, The Smile of the Sphinx. The sum of David Antin's part 11, which corresponds to our part 12, which he titles, and we've reiterated that title, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy, and which I often have added to in America. The sum of that segment 11 in David's original reading, elaboration, and interpretation is a reading, elaboration, and interpretation of first Sophocles' play Oedipus the King, and then second Aristophanes' play The Smile of the Sphinx, and where we are located in our reading, elaboration, and interpretation of David Antin's reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of those two plays, and comparison, I should add, of those two plays, and the varieties of rhetorical difference, between those two plays, which result, both from the fact that one is authored and inspired under the muse Melpomene, that is the muse of tragedy, and one is inspired and creatively developed under the muse Thalia, that is the muse of comedy. Both that fact, bears upon their differences, and the fact that Aristophanes is responding to an entirely different set of social political context than Sophocles is, and part of the implicit argument in David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling, as we saw, right, in his in that section, and I don't recall off the top of my head, what numbered section that is in this long performance piece, Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling, but that section in which he recounts various tellings, various narratings and storytellings of the origin of the pseudologoi, right? And you recall that under one telling, and I believe that telling was Hesiod's. David recalls, and now I can't recall what David recalls, but I believe that he recalls that, and he would be correct. But I believe that he recalls that telling under Hesiod, right, relates the origin of the pseudologoi to their maternal source, right? and beginning in Eris, and then I believe that he also relates that in Aesop they are they have no maternal or paternal origin, but are in fact the craft, right? In the same way that that Daedalus crafts the labyrinth, and they are the craft of Daulis. And then I believe further that he remembers and recounts the fact that in Hyginus that they still have another origin, and that origin is that they have parentage, and that parentage is even more ancient than it is under Hesiod, and that the parents of the pseudologoi, which would make the pseudologoi extraordinarily archaic, but are in fact Gaia and Uranus, and then David says, well, I think we can discount that. I don't know what Hyginus was thinking, but that's a highly questionable origin from the theoretical and conceptual point of view for any ancient Greek who really knows these stories that belong to the mythology, to the mythos logos. But in any case, we have these variations on the story, and he proposes that these variations may result from rhetorical context that situate the tellings in in actual space-time situations, and in actual space-time loci, and that are informed by pedagogical and social political interests. And then he reminds us to remember that he had proposed that when Aesop tells his version of the story, perhaps there was a naughty boy in the audience, and he wanted to make a point, and perhaps this naughty boy was an orphan, and hence the construction of the pseudologoi as the craft, right, or the sort of foster children of Daulis, and perhaps and perhaps as well his sister Apate. Actually, my memory is a little sketchy here, and I'm not certain that David mentions the possibility of a joint, creative venture on the part of Daulis and Apate, or whether he sticks with closely to the telling as it's presented in Aesop. But in any case, he points us to this moment, in his discourse, in which he's suggested that this kind of address, right, this kind of can say site specificity, right, of the rhetorical, let's just say, adventure that the storyteller and narrator engages in. And then he reminds us that at the outset of this piece, right, that he reminds us that at the outset of this piece, that reference had been made to a grand piano and to the various members in the audience, and to how various members in the audience, either resembled, the features of a grand piano, or how their features seemed in complex and curious ways, dissimilar from the structure and forms that are familiar to us as elements of grand pianos, whether these grand pianos were fashioned on Steinway Street or elsewhere. And he mentions all of this at the outset, of this particular piece of his part 11, before he before he engages in a further discussion of and development and elaboration of the differences and similarities, between the way that Sophocles tells this story and the way that Aristophanes tells this story. And he says that you could make it's arguable. You could make an arguable case, and this is in some way an analepsis that we're providing, because I think I omitted the details of his introduction to this section, his part 11, in our earlier discussions of this section, which is our section 12. But so in some ways I'm filling in the details that David Antin provides at the outset of his part 11, which is our part 12, which both he and we and I are calling danger, deception, delusion, dramatikos, eironicus, dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy. But at the outset, he says that the terms for this comparison, and the terms for this comparison are that these differences result from the features that are by formal design, right, and by one could say by musaic genealogy inherent in the genre, right? So features of the genre, and by genre, in this sense, David includes within this notion of genre the techne that belongs to the genre. That is, the technical apparatus or material features, the material constituent elements that belong to the genre. So, for example, if one were talking about a media, like film, versus the stage, all of the technical elements that belong to the apparatus of film, and cinema, as opposed to the technical apparatus that includes, the stage space and how the space is utilized and performed, and the material constraints of existing in a particular location, in a particular duration, right, span of time, and the same would be said if you're talking about the media of video. So you could say that in a certain way that in the terminology that he uses when he refers to genre, at least in this segment, he's also talking about the technical apparatus of the medium, and in large part the technical apparatus for the medium in Thalia and Melpomene is the same, but in specificity and certain elements, right? There are differences. There are differences in the way, for example, a parabasis registers as an element of the technical apparatus in Thalia, and the way that even if the chorus were to address the audience directly under the muse Melpomene in tragedy, that the rhetorical effect would be just necessarily be dissimilar, right, and have kind of a more didactic and an informative, perhaps declarative feel, rather than the way that it seems to function in terms of the comedy, right, of the transgression, and act in conjunction with Dramatikos, eironicus, and Dramatikos, anagnoreikos in a certain way, if we imagine those figures as kind of allegorical figures of Greek comedy, but he says, but of course those words were never, the Greek, words utilized to discuss these effects. But in retrospect, we can formulate them, and because they were two characters, he says, in this particular play that we're going to discuss, because we're at the outset of his part 11 now, and I've performed an analepsis fill in, like, part of what I left out. And I think, one of the reasons that, I left it out was because, we're far behind already in the discussion. And I anticipated, at the outset of our discussion in part 12, his part 11, that we might, exceed, we might exceed in time, in our discussion, what is presented in concise and very specific, measured form in David's discussion. So returning to all of that now and kind of filling in the details. He provides two sets of rationale for these differences. So there's the difference in the form and one could say in elements of the techne. So both the genre and the medium, and even when the medium is defined by relatively similar conditions, if the apparatus, if the technical apparatus that belongs to the medium, right, it never exists, entirely, outside of the genre that it's interacting with. So the rhetorical effects of the specificity of the medium, will always bear upon the relational, right, the relational, manifestations that develop, in regard to the specific constraints of the genre, right? So in other words, even if you had the exact same medium and technical apparatus, but you were talking about say that David says, say you were talking about American drama, conventional American drama as presented in Hollywood cinema, in the period of the 40s, versus comedy, and 40s and 50s, he says, and he says. He says, so say you're making a film and you're located in the 40s and the 50s, and the source material or the subject matter or the content, or the selection of the material you're going to work with is Shakespearean tragedy. And he says, let's say you either select Macbeth, or you select Hamlet, or maybe you select Othello, and he goes on and he recounts and I'm not entirely sure why he does so, but he recounts as many of the Shakespearean tragedies or what we imagine fall under this domain, this descriptor tragedy, as apparently as he can, and it's fairly exhaustive, and I don't know if he in fact recounts all of what contemporary literary studies sort into the identifier tragedy that belongs to this oeuvre of William Shakespeare's, but it seems like he does, and it's certainly it's certainly fairly exhaustive. That's my I'm making today is the day. Our context here is that it's the day before Thanksgiving, and I'm making this is pre-cooking for Thanksgiving, and these are little pumpkins. They're like pumpkin pie pumpkins. But what I'm gonna do is, because we're vegetarians, I'm gonna stuff these little half pumpkins with stuffing, and that stuffing, this is what I'm going to use as the base, for the stuffing is this bulgur wheat, red mill bulgur wheat, and instead of stuffing a turkey, because we don't eat turkey, and then we'll have other things as well, but this is part of the pre-cooking, and that's our context. There are a number of other contexts here as well. I'm wondering if this image is of any relevance, filmed either horizontally or vertically, and I can't really decide. It looks like if you look at it this way, it could be a kind of infinity symbol, I suppose, and we can imagine the cinematic loop that we had discussed, that belongs to David's discussion, is engaging this dynamics here, and then the point at which it comes back. Let's say that it begins here, and this is the onset of the loop, and then this is the whatever the green mamba is doing here, it has to do exactly the same thing here in the loop, right? And this would be the part of the loop that, if we wanted to make a Mobius strip, we would flip upside down, and then we talked about the nature of the apparatus, that is the medium, right? Now, the genre would be well, there really isn't a genre of snake dancing in cinema, but if there was a snake dancing genre in cinema, that would be the genre, right? And then the problem with the materiality of the technical apparatus here was we had begun our work, and David says, this is recounting David's argument, we had the filmmaker had begun right, recording this dance in this genre of dancing snakes in Super 8, right, which has sprockets on one side, and then these loops that were created because if I recall in David's account, these snakes would start to become aggressive after around 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and it could only be filmed for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And this filmmaker wanted these pieces in some kind of an installation. Maybe it was experimental, and in this installation environment, required longer work than the given 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and so the idea of creating a loop, but the loops initially could only be made in a circle, right, and not in a Mobius strip, because the material conditions of the medium were that in Super 8 film, which is what this snake was recorded on, there are only sprocket holes on one side of the film, and so you could make a loop, but you couldn't turn the film over. You couldn't create a Mobius strip, because then the sprocket holes on the left would engage the sprocket holes on the right, and then like a train, right? A train has to follow the track, and then suddenly, if the tracks were different from the tracks that the train could follow, then it would get derailed, right? So the problem with the Mobius strip idea, for this particular experimental use of the medium, was that the material constraints of the medium, limited, the further exploration of ways of developing, loops, and what those loops might convey in terms of the varieties available in this particular 4 minute, 33 second, dance of of the green mamba, and then at that point, when the material constraints of the medium, one could say, had exceeded the limits in which it could be played against the genre of cinematic snake dancing, if that were a genre, then decisions would have to be made about how to go on, either acquiring a new interest in a new genre, or developing ability and performance on a new medium. And I guess the same could be said of a grand piano, that if one wanted to explore like ideas of drone and tonal length in musical interpretation, one would perhaps reach a limit on the keyboard available to a grand piano. Even with one can do different tunings, but even with different tunings, one would probably reach a certain kind of limit, and the constraints of that material element, the grand piano, whether that material element, the grand piano, represents merely as a symbol, the idea of high art, as opposed to the domains, high art and the telaiasis, right? That high art implies, the perfection and completion that it provides. Performs was a parapraxis there, but whether it symbolically relates merely to that, or somehow via metonymic relations also like hints at the limitations of an understanding of your work as belonging to the muse of solely to the muse of parataxis as opposed to the various muses that inform paratactical, hypotactical, and other kind of metaphorical and metonymic relationships that may be variable and complex, right? Like, do I always have to do a circle, or can I do other kinds of things sometime, or what are my limits and constraints, and do I really want to limit my theoretical and conceptual understanding of the nature of a whole domain of work to a single figure such as parataxis, or can I open and expand my can I rearrange the furniture of my mind in a certain way, I suppose, and allow for other and varieties, right, of engagement with both genre and right, genre's intersection with media, and both of their rhetorical deployments under different social political constraints and moments and durations, and anyway, let's go back to the while we're up and out, I might as well get some more. No, I'm doing fine on coffee. I don't think we need any more. All right, so David is talking about that, all of those ideas at the outset, I think, which I'm mentioning now, but which we elided or omitted at the beginning of this segment, our part 12, his part 11, which is the reading, elaboration, and interpretation of his reading and elaboration and interpretation of these similarities and differences, that now that we've developed more clearly in relationship to David's discourse, why he's performing this comparison and contrast between the And David's thinking is always, complex in these ways. He never says it's like, I'm going to compare this genre to this genre. I'm going to compare, the Muse Thalia to the Muse, Melpomene. He never does that. But he says let's, given that that things are complex, right? Given that things are complex and that resultant forms, the resultant forms and resultant experiences always emerge as a he doesn't say collage, and he doesn't say juxtaposition, and he doesn't say confluence, and he doesn't say conflux, but he says as an organization under symphonia, like as an arrangement, right, of a variety of different elements. So that when you're talking about differences between comedy and tragedy, and this is where I think we broke off and started to digress a bit, and we had gotten to the point where he was talking. I'm gonna elide and omit that, where he talks about doing Shakespearean comedy. He talks about doing Shakespearean tragedy, versus 1940s style. I'm gonna elide or omit the his discussion of the distinction between the way that a cinematic apparatus, and the way that it's defined, as a genre, right, or like meta genre in a way, because if you think about the features of Hollywood cinema, there's a certain predictability that it has in relationship to genres, and that predictability isn't entirely defined by the dimensions of the genre itself. Say Shakespearean tragedy, right? Well, Shakespearean tragedy on the stage is very different than the way that Shakespearean tragedy can be expressed as a predictable phenomenon in cinema. And he says and that predictability in cinema belongs to certain modalities of the way, right, that one could say meta genre, like, and what is a meta genre? David says, well, in a way, Hollywood is a kind of meta genre of the way of a manner of doing things. Just like Disneyland, Disneyland is a kind of meta generic take on what this idea of a fantasy playground looks like, and it looks different from other fantasy playgrounds, right? And it combines these features of this kind of childlike vision of what utopia might be as a form of disengaged and sociopolitically irrelevant, like form of play as pastime, and it's very complicated, the way that he elaborates this, but he gets to a point in this elaboration of Hollywood, and the conceptualization of Hollywood as a kind of meta generic take, right, on whatever genre internal to itself it's playing out. And he compares in this manner, Hollywood's take on Shakespearean tragedy, with its own articulation of this genre, the screwball comedy. And I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna elide and skip over that in this digression that relates to what he does in the first part of his part 11, which would, if we had put it in the proper place, be the first part of our part 12. But just so that we can get to where we were in recounting recounting where we actually left off in this, our part 12, danger, deception, delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy with our edition in America, which was Act 1, Scene 1, in Aristophanes' The Smile of the Sphinx, and I believe we ended in that part of Scene 1 in which, and Scene 1 is Tiresias' narration of these three dreams that he has to the audience, who the audience plays the role here of the chorus, right? So it's a kind of parabasis or parabasis, but in fact the chorus, are represented, as a semicircle behind, right, behind Tiresias, and throughout the recounting of their recounting of their dream, and their failure, to mediate this conflict that they're distracted from because of this scopophilic pleasure that they experience in relationship to initially, observing the actions and dances of these two serpents, and then further, and we haven't reached that further yet. And I'm breaking out of David's recounting here to our recounting, but since we haven't reached that point, I'm not going to press on and describe those further pleasures until we actually get to them, actually arrive at them. But Tiresias in these dreams, has been called to perform an act of mediation, and they have failed to perform the required service, and they believe that their status as a sacred seer, and perhaps even their status in relationship to not only their status in relationship to the obligations of the sacred duties of the thaumaturge and prophet, are threatened, but their social status, seems to be threatened as well as their self-understanding. And David, continues, to point back, to his distinction between story and narrative, and to talk about, all of the varieties of ways that this uncertainty and the threat, right, of the loss, right, of all of these, facets of identity that belong to this character Tiresias, inform our understanding of the narrative in David's terms, elements of these dreams. And but he clearly also underscores the fact that this is done in a comedic manner throughout, and that it describes the way that comedy is conveyed. And he doesn't here, if I recall, point to the way that his discussion of cinematic apparatus and the dance of the serpent, is a kind of figuration, right, or an analogy, to the form of the what appears to be like the broken Ouroboros, represented by the chorus, seems to have like some kind of associative or analogical correspondence, right, with the cinematic apparatus that he had talked about, in composing this installation piece that this maybe avant-garde, we could say, or experimental filmmaker wanted to produce, around the dance of these green mambas, and the way that the cinematic apparatus couldn't produce, right, this Mobius strip form because of the material limitations, right, and he doesn't mention that, but he does refer constantly back to the way that Aristophanes, in the way that he presents all of these dramatic elements on stage, the way that they're presented on stage don't explicitly and specifically belong to our understanding of narrative development. But they become, right? They become like supportive, elements in the way that the narrative unfolds. So to think of them like as these, to think of narrativity, he says, as this like linear, progression in time, is to fail to account for all of the various elements that constitute the narrative in relationship to varieties of dimensions in which material objects and forms and strategies of representation are used in space and time across different thresholds of what he refers to as representational ontology. So, for example, like the use of that semicircular chorus as it relates to the idea of broken Ouroboros, but as it frames, right, as it frames like this what we know if we trust, right, the discourse that's provided by this character, Tiresias' wife, their wife Diarmenia, that Tiresias believes that he is addressing her, but he's actually addressing the chorus. So knowing this, we have a rhetorical understanding, if we take her discourse seriously, that when Tiresias, right, is looking out at us, in either the blindness of his reality, or in the wish fulfillment fantasy of his dreaming ability, to see that he's in fact, that we in that discourse, that is framed by Diarmenia, that we represent the chorus, which whom we see behind the figure of Tiresias. But and so our understanding of what position we're in, and what position and who we represent, and where Diarmenia is, but where she is on stage, all have to do with rhetorical constructions of space-time that are complex, and that belong to the dynamics of both the material apparatus, the way that the stage is actually set in physical space and time, and to the rhetorical apparatus of the genre that confuses all this in this comedy of the confusion of space-time, in which Diarmenia, right, is the intended addressee, and the intended addressor is Tiresias. But in fact, as Diarmenia points out, Tiresias, they are actually addressing the chorus, right, and not her. And yet, as it's represented on the stage, the chorus is behind them, is behind Tiresias, and Diomenia is in the audience with us. And so we represent, and her presence among us, guides us in understanding rhetorically, like where we're supposed to be in this complex dance of the rhetorical construction of the relationship between representational space-time and actual space-time in terms of stage and actor and fiction and audience, right? And if you don't understand any of that, and you do intuitively, David says, all of this you understand intuitively, and don't have to think about it too much, or you wouldn't be laughing, right? And it's fairly complex, but often, in theoretical and literary constructions, right, of the terms of what's actually going on, you're presented with this idea of this paraphrase of this story, like, and they seem to forget, like, the complexities in which, like, this story is actually presented, right, and the materials, under which it's presented, and it's imagined, it exists as if it were all happening inside of your mind, and none of these like plays back and forth between these different kinds of constructed fictions of space and time and occurrences, and events in space and time as they exist in your actual engagement, right, with the unfolding of this work, right, as it is a part of the world, like, is what informs your understanding of the story. And so he says, this notion of a linearity and a coherence and a cohesion that somehow, like, can get articulated as the opposite of collage, or like as the simple opposite of collage, is an illusion. It's an utter fantasy of a reification of this idea of narrative in the mind of the experiencing subject that somehow, like, this guy forgot. This guy forgot all about all of the complex relationships that are set up by a figure like Diomenia when she says, and he thought, he thought he was talking to me, David, and David gets the pronoun wrong because and then he switches to her, and she thought, she was talking to me, and as we pointed out, we would just say, and they thought they were talking to me, Diomenia says, but they were actually, looking and talking to the chorus, and in fact, in our space time, they are, looking and talking, to the audience. So if we don't understand, that this is part of the complexity, with which all of these domains of representations are interacting and informing our understanding and of the unfolding of this story and narrative, then we fail really to recognize the complexities under which we're asked and expected to experience ourselves in multiple ways, in multiple positionalities and in multiple dimensions within the ways that the story itself is edited and pieced together, from the relationships constituted, right, by discrepancies, similarities, oppositions, and modes, right, modes of disjunction between the rhetorical framing devices, through which we regard, the narrative, the material constraints, right, of the material of the reality of the medium, in this case, the theater, but it could equally well be, film, and the fictive domains that are in some ways, right, that are in some ways not in a strict ineluctable manner, David says, but in some ways, constrained by, the terms and one could say social contract that we engage as an understanding that we are, experiencing, right, the restrictions of a particular genre under the authority of a particular muse, right, and that our interpretation, right, of this experience of this fictive domain is informed by our understanding of the constraints and terms and obligations that are required, right, to engage this particular muse under this particular muse's own terms and set of constraints, right, and then. So that in part is what David did at the outset of this piece, which we had, as I mentioned, elided and omitted earlier. But let's see if we can get back to where we are, and of course where we are in this reading, elaboration, and interpretation of David Antin's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Aristophanes, The Smile of the Sphinx, is in Act 1, Scene 1, David's recounting of the way that Aristophanes unfolds and presents this dream or series of dreams that Tiresias has, that motivate and inspire him, to act in the course, right, in the course of the unfolding of this comedy that is situated in this particular moment that precedes the plague that will befall on Thebes. So if one wanted to make an analogous, comparison, between the plague in Thebes and the COVID virus, and also, right, the plague of fascism that we began experiencing in full, in that period and duration of time that's represented, between the years of 2016 and 2024, and then David again does not go beyond that, perhaps leaving that element of future memory out, so as not to articulate his understanding of our world and the opportunities that are given to us in our world, not to confuse, right, the potentialities of our actions with the inscriptions of faith that belong to the construction of a mythology or a mythos logos, but says that so if one were, right, to make that analogy between the moment that Tiresias, find themselves in, David, would have used either find himself in or find, herself in. But, when we can remember, to slip out of whatever, pronoun that David deployed in whatever particular moment, he deployed, that particular pronoun in relationship to Tiresias, when we can remember to, perform our own, transformation his use of language to a more appropriate and contemporaneous usage. We do so. And but if one were to, David says, him at this point, but himself, but we'll say. But if one were to imagine this analogy, between this future of Thebes, right, and this future of America, he says, Tiresias would be where we are now. He says, this would be, perhaps not exactly. David says, perhaps not exactly October 15th, 2003, but it would be, it would be sometime, sometime near our now. And so we can imagine in relationship, right? If we imagine, our space and time, and Tiresias' space and time as analogous to one another. He's this dream that he has occurs in our now, and it's about our future. It's about the what'll happen in our future, when we experience this plague called the COVID virus, and when we experience this social collapse and destruction of democracy that we call fascism in America under Donald Trump, and that too, if not a literal plague, is a plague of the malignant psyche, right, of the violent and toxic, white supremacist imagination, the horror, right, of what it is, and then he references Eric Fromm to be unable, completely unable and incapable of experiencing the dimensions of love, and being incapable, of experiencing the dimensions of love, of falling into this aggressive and violent, malignancy that is the psychological structure of fascism. And he says, and so when we read and regard, right, the moment of this dream, and if we want to compare it, to our experience now, Tiresias is having their dreams, and David doesn't use their here. He uses, she says she is not having her dreams. David says, but we're just going to say they're not having their dreams. In that future moment, when Trump is president, or after Trump is initially defeated in the second election, but then refuses, right, to recognize the reality in front of his eyes, and inspires this insurrection on January 6th. We're not in that moment. We're in our moment, and what Tiresias is dreaming about is their future. Although he doesn't say their, he says her future, but we're just going to say their future, and their need to act, to prevent this moment from happening. And David says, and that's what the second dream is all about, and that's how the second dream, gets tied to the first dream and the idea of these serpents and what they represent in relationship to the caduceus and the idea of healing. Because recall, this idea of healing and medicine that belongs to the caduceus, isn't just a metaphor here, but relates, to this, this social experience of an actual plague, right? Which hasn't happened yet, but the dream is warning about it because it's a prophetic dream. It's a visionary dream of the future. It's related to, Tiresias' prescience as a seer, right? And his relationship to all of those forms of seeing, like Cassandra, whether people believe them or not. It's part of his work, and part of his work is because recall, he's sacred, and his work belongs to the muse thaumaturgia. It's not just an illusion. Although it's played out in a certain way as an illusion and as a deception in Aristophanes because it's a comedy. But just because it's a comedy and just because it's funny, doesn't mean that it doesn't have real stakes, or that he doesn't, or that, and then, we'll correct, David here, and say, doesn't mean that, their work, doesn't have real stakes. And then, so Tiresias, is a seer and an interpreter of dreams. His wife, and then, we'll correct David there and say their wife. David says, is interpreter, but she, and then we can correct him again, but they are also an interpreter, of these sacred visions. And their work belongs to the thaumaturgia. He didn't say they, but we're just going to correct him in advance. And even if the thaumaturgia is occurring, within the comedy, and Aristophanes, subordinates the thaumaturgia to Thalia, for Tiresias, the stakes still belong to, and I'll say there, but he says her, their sacred role as healer and as mediator, of these divine laws. And so if we understand this, he says, then we can understand how these dreams, whether they take the form of comedy or absurdity, and as absurd and comic as they may be, beneath all that, or within all that, or beyond all that, is this powerful narrative, in my sense of the term, narrative, he says, and not just a story. And this is where we are in recounting this, and we're at that moment where, and I'll just use the pronoun they, even though David uses the pronoun she here. He says, where she, and I'll just say where they, begin recounting their second dream. And in the recounting of the second dream, what becomes clear is that, all of the symbolic values that arose there in the first dream, are clarified in relationship to this story of the encounter between Oedipus and Laius, and what's at stake, for the future of Thebes, which analogously is the future of the United States, the future of our democracy in the United States, he says, but also, the future of our health and well-being in the United States if we allowed these sacred terms to be destroyed and violated. And so we may not immediately recognize that the second dream that Tiresias has and attempts to narrate to there, he says her, or actually he says his here at this point. He says his, but we'll say their wife Diomede, the interpreter, that they're completely relevant to our experience today, because they provide a model, for our action, and the terms, through which, our self-understanding, as being responsible, right, for the health and welfare of our future democracy, but also like literally the health and welfare of our future society. And the terms, under which, our actions, as they're directed toward the future, can belong, if not to this idea of a thaumaturgia, because maybe we don't believe in that anymore, or maybe we do. But he says, but even if not, to a thaumaturgia, at least, to a healthy, means and manner of engaging our social responsibility. Directed at, protecting, that health and welfare that already belongs to our society, and of establishing, conditions under which, a health and welfare, can, become part of our society if it doesn't exist there already, right? So when we go back, and I'm about to do it, he says, and begin, narrating Tiresias's, this second dream, it says important to perhaps keep in mind, that this is an analogy, and in some ways, an allegory of this period, of time between 2016 and 2024. And we're going to have to face, some of these same conditions. We're going to have to face tyranny. We're going to have to, face our own fears and inactions, and perhaps, come to terms, with our own, blindness and self-deception. Before, maybe even before we can act in any manner whatsoever, we have to come to terms with all of that. And he says, so let's do that. Let's return. He says, let's return to Tiresias' dream and begin narrating their dream. And he says, of course, her dream, but let's begin narrating their dream. Where we left off, and you'll recall that Tiresias is on the stage. The stage is he's there. He says him again. They're holding their walking staff, right? And they're not in the course of the dream, but they're right at the outset of engaging and narrating the actions and meanings of the second dream, and he says right before he begins, and remember that what I want to do is point out all of the way that the features, the material features, and the what we could call medium, that belong to the Greek comedy and the stage and the place of the audience and all of the forms of this particular medium, and as they relate to the genre, which belongs to the muse. Thalia, that is the genre of comedy, right, interact in the expression of the unfolding of the narrative elements of this particular segment, the second dream, and that without looking and analyzing all of that, we misconstruct our understanding of narrative and of storytelling, and we reify it, right, as this function of imagination that is about recalling the abstraction of a story, that belongs to the way that we piece, right, these fragments together, more than it does to the elements, from which they're constituted, and therefore, always already, if we imagine that narrative, like, always already includes the work that we've already performed as active and engaged interpreters, and in order to go back and look at like the construction of this work, as it is, in some ways, always already a collage, right, or a montage of these multiple elements and conditions, under which we as interpreters create it and idealize it into this illusion, right, of a coherent narrative. Like, we've already performed that. And that process, if we really want to understand it from a phenomenologically sophisticated point of view, we have to go back and reconstitute. And that's what this is about. And then, once we do all that, then we'll go back and talk about how, right, an understanding, a more complex understanding of the way that illusion as coherency and cohesion, right, is constituted, by our phenomenological experience, right, of all these disparate and diffuse material elements and their interactions and rhetorical, connections with genre and these other domains of, fictional organization and representation. We'll talk about the way that more complex and deeper, right, understanding of like the phenomenology, out of which the illusion of a coherent narrative is fashioned in our experience. Relates or can relate, right, to the social-political relevancy of our ability, to perform, judgments in a complex world, that involves relationships between our observation, right, of rhetorical domains and our interpretation of them in terms of social responsibility and our belonging to a world, right, in which we in no way, shape, or form can say, well, Leia said that it was true, so it must be true. Or this was the prophecy, so we're going to have to recount those votes. Or, well, the Sibylline Muse Q, told me that Trump was going to win. So I didn't pay any attention to the election results because I already knew that it had to be the case, right? So understanding, right, the complexities of the way that we build a narrative, out of, bits and pieces, and evaluate the terms of the bits and pieces and where they come from, and the complexities of our reifications, in terms of processes of identification, between this and that element, of a narrative. You bear upon, the cognitive relevance, of our understanding of aletheia, the pseudologoi, of eris, of harmonia, and our opportunities, right? Our opportunities of arrangement as they relate, to the expression of our actions and performance in the world. And so we'll get to that, he says. But that's going to take some time. And he laughs, because it's fairly complicated. He says we'll get to that, but that's right now. That's all off over there, and then he makes this gesture over there. But it's distant, but it's not. But it's not something that exists in the clouds. It exists. It's real, just like 2016 seems distant from where we are today, he says, in 2003, but it's no less real than we are here in 2003. 2016 is just as real as we are. It's just that it seems like it's over here, and that's different from being in the clouds, and so in a certain way, he says, the reification of narrative, right? You could say the reification of the coherence of a narrative out of all of these parts, whether deceptive or non-deceptive, right? It seems like it's an imaginary, but it's an imaginary that has very real symbolic and material consequences on the conditions under which we act and perform in the world, and therefore the conditions under which society organizes itself, either in terms of equality and freedom and liberty, or in terms of oppression and subjugation and destruction, and one could say, right, the very life of the planet, depends upon our interpretation and experience of these narratives, and how we respond to them. And so it's worth telling these stories. And so it's worth, understanding the way that we understand these stories. And so it's worth understanding and interrogating the ways that we might be deceived by such stories. And he goes on, but we'll skip, most of how he goes on, and jump back into where we were, where Tiresias is on stage. They're holding their walking stick. They're addressing Diarmenia, and they're about to begin narrating the second dream.